You're here, which means that you've found Spirit Crumbs, leading you to your inner light worker. I will be sharing how these tiny little hints from the universe have led me to where I am today. I hope that by hearing my story and the stories of others, you'll pick up your own spirit crumbs along the way that will lead you to somewhere magical. Thanks for coming along for the journey. Let's see where it takes us. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Spirit Crumbs. I'm Andrea McCallum, your host. I'm an intuitive oracle card reader, energy healer, and Celestine Prophecy enthusiast. Yes, so today we are talking about the first insight in the book by James Redfield. And the first insight that he encounters is called a critical mass. So he first encounters this manuscript from his friend Aunt Charlene, and she explains this concept of how it begins with an unconscious restlessness. And this is with each individual and also just in general in society. That's what I love about this book, is that each of the insights can be applied. You can see how they can be applied to an individual, but then what might happen if everyone started experiencing this. So with this one, he talks about this restlessness and that we aren't really sure what's missing, but we just know that we're not feeling fulfilled and we're getting a little frustrated that things just don't feel like they're whole. And it's one of my favorite things is that they talk about how we know that we have these magical moments that we enjoy where things start to come together and then we kind of forget about them again. And so once we start becoming conscious of coincidences in life that bring us this magical feeling, we start to get a glimpse of what could be possible. So when you have a hint of something you might want to do, you just don't know how it might happen, which is what we talked about in my outline of how spirit crumbs work, that whole process, that we don't really know how it's going to happen. And then suddenly you meet someone or you read something that brings to your awareness a way that might happen. And so the way they describe it is that it's like an unexplained force of destiny where you were meant to be at that place at that time. And so it brings this kind of, I guess, formula, you could say, that they talk about where it's this mystery that brings excitement and then makes us realize we feel alive in those moments. And that's what this idea of being restless and knowing that there's these moments, that's why we're having those moments. It's these times when destiny and this unexplained force brings us these coincidences that correspond to our thoughts. And so in this book, they talk about how there are a lot of different philosophers and different religions and spiritual beliefs that have touched on this before, that have experienced it. It's not brand new. It's just that it's kind of the starting point for this particular manuscript's insights. And the other half of it, the title of the insight, A Critical Mass, is that this can impact the collective if enough people start experiencing it. So in the first insight, they talk about how it's going to take a large quantity of people starting to acknowledge these coincidences and start to follow them and see where they're taking them in order to make a difference. And so a large number of people awakening to these coincidences and this underlying force. And then when it reaches a critical mass, when enough people are experiencing this collectively, that's when the next insight becomes revealed. So people on their own, individuals, can come to each insight as individuals and have them come to them, and that's fine. people are doing it at different rates. And that's the same as right now in the world. Some people are very spiritual and are trying to connect to themselves and follow their intuition. And then other people are doing their own thing. They're maybe, having these things happen, but maybe not realizing that they're connected to a deeper meaning. And so in the next insight, when he speaks to someone about this insight, it's also mentioned that he has just read the first insight, has just heard about it. And the gentleman he's speaking to asks him, well, I see kind of like here skeptical. And he's like, did you kind of think about it and think that's interesting? Now let's get back to practical things. And the main character kind of laughs and says, yeah, that's kind of what I thought. And then he says, that's what people tend to do. The tendency is to dismiss it and then get back to their practical, logical way of being. And so that's why this awakening and awareness doesn't happen for most of us, even though we know we have these things that happen. And at the moment, you're like, this is a crazy coincidence. And that's it. That's where we leave it, right? We just take it from there. Sometimes we follow it, sometimes we don't, and just think that was cool and let it be that. And so for me, reading this as the first insight after I had the thought, the intuition, maybe it's time to read that, following the synchronicities, the number of times it came up in conversation, and then finally actually reading the book within the first few pages and remembering that this whole concept of the book is based on these coincidences that lead you through all of the insights. I was like, those are spirit crumbs. This guy like followed his intuition to have dinner with this friend that he hadn't seen in a long time, even though he wanted to just spend time alone. He had kind of isolated himself. He still followed it and was like, I guess there's a reason this person's reaching out to me. Follows the insight, the intuition. She tells him about it, and then he acts on it. He actually ends up going to find out more about this. So that part I will give, which is a spoiler. I am putting spoiler alert in all of the descriptions for the episodes. But he gets on a plane and decides to go to Peru instead of just sitting there thinking, oh, maybe somebody will eventually come and tell me about this. He's like, no, I'm gonna act on this. This feels important to me. So as he's talking to this man, they start discussing it. And, when I acted on reading the book and realized, oh my gosh, this is perfect, it was just at the point where I was starting to think I had so many ideas of what to do for my first few episodes. So the first few, of course, I knew were going to be introducing myself and spirit crumbs and how that fits into other things, and more general things. But I was like, what is the first juicy thing that we're going to dig into? So I know that some of this will be repetitive in terms of talking about spirit crumbs, but I also think that this book is just so interesting. So having these episodes there, if somebody reads the book 6 months or a year from now, you don't get around to reading the book, but you listen to these episodes. When you read the book, you can always come back to these and see if your perception has changed based on your own experiences. Because, like I said, I read this book. I said that I think 2017, but I think I've read it since then. I think I might have read it in the last couple of years because it felt more recently. But anyways, you may decide to come back to these even just to refresh yourself on these concepts if you're starting to feel restless, you're feeling an unconscious restlessness at some point. Maybe it's something you'll revisit. And I also really just appreciated that this, like I said, it's a fictional book, but it has so much truth to it. And I think that's true of a lot of fiction, that there's this connection that we make to the characters and the stories. And there are so many authors that are so wise, and that's their way of sharing their truth. And I think that it was at a time where I was getting a lot of cards in my own daily ritual that were talking about speaking my truth. In fact, one of the cards that was coming up was from the deck that I had mentioned, the Celtic Tree Oracle, and it's the card for the beech tree. And the message from that is that beech is actually from the same root word as book. And what's funny is I got this card a few times over Christmas. And in fact, about 2 days ago, before I started actually finally getting around to doing these episodes, it was like a final confirmation that I needed to do these because it talks about in the description for that card how you're going to perhaps go back to an old book and reinterpret the knowledge from your own perspective. And I was like, okay, that's like, I couldn't possibly get a more clear sign or spirit crumb to move forward, right? Like that was an action step. That's telling me literally you are going to share your perspective of the teachings of this book. That wasn't just a synchronicity, that had an action step to it, right? It was a synchronicity the first couple times when I hadn't quite thought of sharing it on my podcast. It was just to read it. But when I had started reading it and got that message again, it was like, this is why we wanted you to read it. It wasn't just for your own personal path, which it does impact me on that level. But it's the idea that like we are currently in a time when people are feeling restless and they're really wondering how are we going to enact the change that we need in the world, and all these questions of like uncertainty, right? Where nobody really knows what's next. And we've moved into a whole new cycle. We're in the age of Aquarius. And people are like, what does that mean? You know, now instead of focusing on material things, we've realized that now there should be a bigger focus on ideas and caring for one another and the collective. And I think that because this transformation, as it says in the manuscript, requires a large number of people, we really need to work towards that critical mass, even, just speaking of from like a social justice perspective. We need a significant amount of people signing petitions and showing their support and thinking of actual solutions in their communities to make a difference for racial equality and equity and indigenous rights and the protection of our earth and all of these things. And the idea of a critical mass for anything just makes you think like, well, how many people does it take? How long will this take? What is the tipping point where we're going to be on the other side of this? And that's what none of us can really know at this point, because we haven't done it yet. It's not something that we've achieved. So the next insight I think is going to be really helpful in terms of kind of course, continuing from this insight, because it talks more about the cultural aspects of this manuscript and the end goals and like how we move forward. So I'm not going to say too much more about this one, because I think that talking about spirit crumbs and the fact that coincidences are so important in this book and in the manuscript insights, and just keeping in mind as we go forward, and just for yourself for the next week or as long as you can. I do it all the time, so I'm hoping this sticks. But at least for the next week, maybe have a little journal or a notebook or something where every time you think of something and then the answer comes to you in a really interesting way, make note of it. And even maybe if you're not seeing anything right away, maybe you're at a good place right now where you're not really thinking of next steps, but maybe you think back to the job you're in now or how you met your partner, any of those things. Think back to like where there might have been some coincidences or synchronicities or spirit crumbs that led you to that, because I would love to hear them. So you can always send me a message or comment on the post for this episode at Spirit Crumbs on Instagram or on my Concrete and Crystals Instagram as well, because I'm sure I'll be talking about it over there. And I can't wait to share with you the next insight, which is called The Longer Now. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Spirit Crumbs. You can find me on Instagram for this podcast at Spirit Crumbs, or you can also find me at Concrete and Crystals for my own spiritual offerings and more tidbits about my own journey. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.